look, we should expect that goods turn up on the shelves and that there's electricity when you flick the lights on. You shouldn't have to think or worry about freight distribution in your everyday life. And it's the success of the freight industry that we don't. But that means that people don't see it, they don't understand it.
Welcome to Calling All Stations, the transport podcast. I'm Christian Waller, an author and journalist who's covered transport for the past 30 years. In every episode, we try to keep you up to date with the most engaging news stories, policy developments, and interviews in the transport world. And with me is my regular co-presenter, Mark Walker, who has spent decades looking at transport policies and legislation. So, Mark, what are we covering today?
Hello, Christian, and hello to our listeners. Today's episode starts off with a discussion between yourself and Maggie Simpson, the Director General of the Rail Freight Group, which, as the name implies, is the trade association representing everybody connected with the conveyance of goods by train. We'll also, following on from that conversation, have a look at the progress that's been made recently with the Railways Bill through Parliament and the establishment of Great British Railways, and in particular, how that affects the freight sector. Later on, we'll be reviewing and discussing your latest book, Christian, Fast Track, the extraordinary story of high-speed rail, which is about to be published. In the coverage of rail reform and the passage of the Railways Bill that we've explored in earlier episodes of this podcast, the position of rail freight has always been a matter of the highest importance. One of the most powerful voices on rail freight in this country is the Rail Freight Group, whose Director General is Maggie Simpson. Christian has caught up with Maggie to discuss where the RFG thinks they are with rail reform and what they hope to see happen during the remaining stages of the process.
I'm with Maggie Simpson, who runs the Rail Freight Group, to talk about the implications for rail freight of the Railways Bill and how she sees the future for rail freight, where, of course, the government says they want a 50% increase by 2050. So, Maggie, tell us, first of all, how you see the Railways Bill and what you are kind of lobbying on, basically.
Yeah, thanks, Christian. And really timely that we're, recording this today as sitting here right now. The Railways Bill is having its second reading in the House of Lords. So really timely. And I think, we're looking forward to reading the transcripts of that debate when they appear tomorrow. But the Railways Bill is obviously a hugely important piece of legislation. It fulfills the government manifesto commitment, the creation of Great British Railways. It builds on the passenger nationalisation programme, which was legislated for early in this government. So, this is a piece of policy that is happening. And what we're trying to do with our members is make sure that, in doing that the needs and desires of the rail freight industry are taken
because they often get forgotten about, don't they?
Yeah, I mean, look, freight gets overlooked.
Yes.
And I often think it's a good thing that freight gets overlooked. We should expect...
we use a passenger on the rail.
Yeah, no, but, we should expect that goods turn up on the shelves and that there's electricity when you flick the lights on. You shouldn't have to think or worry about freight distribution in your everyday life. And it's the success of the freight industry that we don't. But that means that people don't see it, they don't understand it. They think it's like the passenger railway, when really it isn't at all like the passenger railway, aside from the fact that it's got the same wheels on the same rails. All its dynamics are very different. So making sure that, a piece of legislation works for both sides is complicated. Look, there are some things in the bill that we really like. We like the commitment to publishing a rail freight growth target that GBR, Great British Railways, has to have regard to. Great British Railways has a statutory duty to promote the interests of freight. That's really good. And there are some clauses in there that will allow Great British Railways to offer a discount, for example, for new traffic, or maybe for use of electric traction, or a whole host of potential things That's enshrined in the legislation as we've seen it as well. So there are some things in there that we really like. But if we're going to get that growth, we're going to get that, new traffic onto rail, if rail freight is going to help government deliver its wider ambitions, then we need to get the rest of the legislation right as well.
So what's your main concern about the rest of the legislation?
So I think most of our concerns really sit in the replumbing of the rules around access. So the legislation effectively rips up all of the track access and charging rules that we operate under today, puts in place a new framework which gets described in something called the Access and Use Policy. We're expecting a consultation on that. It hasn't happened yet, maybe the autumn. And that will set out a whole new framework for how we get pass on the network, how we get capacity and what we have to pay for them.
That's interesting. So access and use.
Access and Use Policy, yeah.
Right. This is a new one, isn't it? Because at the moment, how did you get PALs before?
So today, track access ultimately is handled by the rail regulator.
Right.
So you would apply to Network Rail for an access right. If they say yes, great, the ORR rubber stamp it. If they say no, you'd go to the ORR. They might say yes or they might no. You've got that mechanism. And then you'd get something called a track access right. It's written into your track access contract. It gives you a period of certainty over that.
Right. So now,
in the new proposals, we haven't seen the Access and Use Policy yet, but what the law says is that the ORR are removed completely from that role, that aside from an appeal function, which more on in a moment, but GBR will decide who gets capacity on the network, and they'll do that to deliver public interest or fund the requirements or a whole host of different things. And in doing that, GBR gets to have to balance its duty, have regard to the freight growth target, but also to its other duties as well. So fare box, what the mayors are asking for, where there's a partnership, passenger revenue growth, performance, all of those good things. So on the face of it, what's not to like? You hand out the capacity for the best value, but of course the practical details of that are really complicated. How do you decide that? What happens if a freight train gets in the way of you doing that? So, does that train then get taken off the network? How does that work? Do people still get access rights or whatever it's called, capacity commitments? I think in their contract they're described somewhere else. It's not clear.
So you said there's an appeal procedure.
So the bill describes an appeals procedure, but it is so high level. It's so difficult
To appeal.
Right. So first of all, we have to be able to effectively meet judicial review principles. So we would have to prove that Great British Railways had broken the law. We'd have to take an appeal then to the rail regulator.
Broken the law?
In effect, because that's how you take a judicial review. You'd have to be able to either broken the law or not.
And what
fraudulently follow. Well, going through Parliament today.
Yeah, right.
But also with it, that's slightly unfair. But within the Access and Use Policy, that they've not followed their own processes and procedures properly. Right. But if they followed their own policies and procedures and your train's been chucked off the network, you can't appeal that. You would only be able to appeal it if you could prove that
it goes against the principles of what they're supposed to do.
Policy is.
Right. And their policy is their policy. I mean, they can determine the policy.
Right. So we have to meet JR principles.
Right.
And then the ORR can look at that and then they'll say, GBR, we don't know what you've done, go and have another think about it. So GBR might well go and have another think and come up with the same conclusion. And so the ORR can look at it, send it back to GBR, have another look, they might have another look and conclude the same or different. And very, very, very limited circumstances, the ORR can say to GBR, no, this is the decision you should have taken. But only, I think, if it's a breach of law and very limited circumstances. So we have to have a very high threshold to get there. And even if we do get there, there's not much the ORR can do about it.
So to use sexist language, the ORR has been rather emasculated.
Yeah. And at the same time, government's creating a whole new passenger watchdog to look after passengers if GBR does something wrong.
Yeah.
Which is a merit.
It's had a beefed up transport focus. Yeah.
And fine, I have no view on that. But passengers are getting really well looked after.
Right.
Whereas our ability to appeal is being very much watered down.
Presumably, then you're worried that GBR will just focus on its passenger obligations and forget about freight.
Yeah, I mean, everyone's behaving really well. The people we talk to at GBR, the bits of the network that are going to become GBR are really on point on freight. And, I wouldn't want to suggest that sitting here today, I'm seeing people displaying bad behaviour. But when we legislate for the long term, 30 years or however long it takes until it's re-legislated against. And there will be a cultural shift at GBR to liking its own trains. I mean, that's human nature, right?
Right.
So we can't get away from the fact that they will want their own trains to succeed, and they'll probably want their own trains to succeed a little bit more than they want other people's to, right?
Right. And so what might be the consequence of that?
So you might, in extremis, you might not have the capacity to run the services that you want.
Even though that's another government target. So GBR will be tasked with that.
So GBR will be tasked with meeting the government's target, but the target could be changed. GBR has to have regard to it, but it's not obligated to do it. I don't think that's a likely proposition at the moment, but things change, yeah. But also just on the day to day, how GBR behaves even on changes. So, for example, if it's very hot and there's restrictions put on the network, does freight get banned? Does it allow to run?
Yeah.
Things happen where we need to make short-term changes. So if it's high wind, for example, some of the ports might close because they can't lift containers.
Right.
So then we move trains, so that flexibility, how do we bake that in? How is GBR going to work as a national system when it's based around business units? So there's lots of complexities, and we're just trying to make sure that we've got the right, the appropriate safeguards in place in the law and in the policies that provide the support we need for a whole host of potential situations that could arise.
Have the politicians responded to that? Presumably you've been pressing this case. Well, I know you've been pressing this case for ages. So have they responded to this?
Yeah, I mean, there's been lots of supportive and warm words, and that's been true through the Bill Committee and the Commons, and in our meetings with ministers and indeed with the team at DfT. I genuinely think they want to get this right, but we haven't got any bill amendments yet. I mean, I'm not surprised by that. I wasn't expecting it. We'll see what happens in the Lords, and then it's looking at all those next level down documents.
What is the amendment you'd like then? The most important amendment you like?
Well, the one I would really like would be to change Clause 68, the ORR appeals function, to firstly remove the requirement to meet JR principles so that it can be more of a merits-based review, and then give the ORR some stronger powers over changing a decision if they find the GBR's acted incorrectly. There's also some amendments we'd like to see that tidy up some of the clauses. So there are things, for example, there are two clauses, Clause 60 about infrastructure capacity planning and Clause 63 about GBR's own trains. Everyone tells us that 63 is subsidiary to 60, but the law doesn't say that. So perhaps we could make the law say that.
Right.
And there's similar concerns around Clause 72, which is a tidying up clause for some of the other legislation, but it doesn't say that it is. So in the way it's drafted, it leaves the Secretary of State with an extant power to interfere in private terminals, in effect.
You've obviously had a lot of fun kind of going line by line with this legislation. But to just broaden it out, rail freight has just about held its own over the last few years, hasn't it? And where do you see any potential growth? Because obviously coal has all gone.
Sure.
I suspect that wood chips will go eventually as well. Because I think the whole idea of wood chips being green is kind of weird, and somebody might suddenly decide that. So where would you see the growth to kind of make up that? I mean, is it all going to be containers?
No, I mean, I don't think it's all containers at all. I mean, just on the wood chip, whatever the rights and wrongs, it produces about 8% of the nation's electricity.
I know.
So it would be pretty daft to turn it off to being able to come in for prominent alternative scenarios.
It's hardly green. Yeah, they kind of,
I agree. I don't think it'll be around forever. But I mean, look, rail freight today is about 40% containers, most of 90% of which come out of the big port. We've got Felixstowe, Southampton, London, Liverpool, Teesside, some others.
Okay.
there is definitely market share to be had out of those ports. We're not, at the levels we could be. So there's growth there. The other 10% warehouse to warehouse, so domestic, again, a huge opportunity there if we can get the economics right. But actually, if you pair up a rail flow with an electric HGV, bearing in mind that 2035 is the deadline for electric HGVs, that works really well because the range of an electric HGV works really well out of a railhead to do that last mile distribution. So there's growth there. But, then we're looking at the construction market. I mean, that's a little bit suppressed today because house building isn't really where it needs to be. But if you look at the big infrastructure programs, so Sizewell is starting now. There's 3 enormous reservoirs going for planning consent. There's green energy build out.
HS2.
New towns. These are all huge consumers of construction materials.
And that should be carried by rail freight.
Yeah, absolutely. And will be either, in many cases, either through new terminals or driving throughput through existing terminals. And then, there are really active discussions going on at how rail freight can support the hydrogen economy, carbon capture and storage, if those sectors take off. And, that's a policy matter beyond the railways. But if they start to happen, rail freight can be really instrumental in helping unlock those markets as well.
I saw today that the Rail Industry Association has just brought out a pamphlet about infilling electrification for freight. Can you just kind of explain what needs to be done and how feasible that is?
Yeah, so I mean, look, if you want to make progress on decarbonising rail freight, it's not, we're lucky compared to many other sectors in that the technology is proven, it exists. Yeah, it's there. I think obviously you have to be realistic about the amount of money that government wants to put into electrifying the railways. So what we're talking about, and Ria's pamphlet emphasises that, is how can we maximise what we can do given the network that we've got effectively. And there are 2 or 3 things that you can do around that. One is make sure you've got enough power in the overhead wires that exist to enable freight to run alongside the ever-increasing passenger demand.
That's an issue, right?
Yeah. So, I mean, a passenger train today with aircon and Wi-Fi uses more power than it used to have, 20 years ago. So there are lots of places on the network we need to strengthen the power supply, and that will enable the freight locos that we have to use the wires that we have.
Oh, right.
We need to incentivize people to use that electric traction that they've got. So we've got, the Class 99s coming, for example, making sure that they get the right discounts, the right pricing to encourage their use, making sure that the price of electricity is, affordable. And then thirdly, those small strategic gaps. I mean, if you took the 3-mile gap out of the Port of London Gateway, of course you can use a Class 99, but there's 10 of those in the country, out of a fleet of 500 locos.
To run with
the diesel engine for those,
right.
But actually, if you've got that capability, why are you using it for 3 miles? Surely you'd be better using it where you can close a gap of 20 miles or 30 miles. So where there's a bit
3-mile gap outside the London.
Yeah, from the port entrance up to the
and then it all becomes a bit
all the way to Scotland.
And how come we've never dealt with that before?
I mean, it's been on top of everyone's to-do list for a while, but the money's not going into freight enhancements. It's certainly not going into electrification. Some people say, "Oh, the port should pay," and the port go, "Well, yeah, fine, but what capacity do we get if we do?" And there isn't a mechanism for answering that question, so it's an impasse.
Right. So, basically, to end off, Maggie, are you optimistic?
I'm always optimistic.
That doesn't quite answer my question. I mean, are you, do you feel that we're moving in the right direction?
So look, I think people genuinely want rail freight to succeed. It's absolutely instrumental to delivering government's wider objectives on house building and green energy. That message, I think, is landing. But people also want GBR's passenger services to succeed. So we just need to have the right frameworks in place to make sure that we stand a chance of getting that balance right for the long term.
So there's plenty of work for the Rail Freight Group and Maggie Simpson.
Plenty of work.
Thank you, Maggie, for coming on Calling All Stations. So I thought that was quite a compelling interview because there is a fear amongst the rail freight fraternity and sorority that essentially Great British Railways is going to be all about passenger transport, and therefore freight will be forgotten, despite the fact there's some government targets to ensure that rail freight is boosted. So do you think that those fears are being allayed in the Railways Bill, Mark, or do you think they're right to be worried about it?
I think they're probably right to keep up the pressure and to get as many concessions as they can during the remaining stages of the Railways Bill, which has now reached the House of Lords. So for overseas listeners, that's the upper chamber of the British Parliament. And in the run-up to the consideration of the bill by the House of Lords, the Minister, Lord Hendy, has been sending some positive noises, I think it's fair to say, towards the rail freight industry to allay some of their fears. But it's only later on, as the bill is considered in detail by a committee of the House of Lords, that we'll see whether that transforms into actual amendments onto the face of the bill to allay those anxieties that the rail freight community have.
Do you think that your rail freight might actually lose out because of this focus on passenger rail? I mean, do you think that maybe there should be a Great British Railways freight wing or something to kind of bat for them?
Well, the sort of magic bullet that the government proposes for rail freight is the target, the freight growth target, which rather curiously and differently will be written into the legislation in a way that won't apply to passenger services. So their suggestion is that, well, if by law the government and Great British Railways have got an obligation to grow freight by a particular amount over a particular time, then that will feed through into all of their actions and activities. And that therefore the freight community, the operators and the customers, crucially, don't have to worry so much about this. Against that is the argument that we've heard from Maggie and that you've sort of alluded to just there, Christian, is that if you create a great big beast in Great British Railways, which owns the infrastructure, controls the infrastructure and access to it, and also operates loads and loads of of passenger trains, whose users are tremendously politically influential because they have votes. Therefore, the tendency of the organisation will always be to support the passenger interest over freight. And that's the dilemma, which is probably at the heart of this process.
And so, Mark, the Railways Bill is currently in the House of Lords for its second reading. And what news do we have of its progress there?
Well, I think while you were meeting with Maggie, the bill was undergoing its second reading debate in the House of Lords, which is where the government sets out the principles and objectives of the bill, and the House has to decide in principle whether to allow it to proceed. So that was a debate that went on for several hours on the 7th of July, where the bill was introduced by the Minister, Lord Hendy. And then a number of backbenchers spoke in support or with issues or concerns they wanted to raise. And then there was a wind-up by the spokespersons for the Liberal Democrats, the Conservatives, and then finally the Minister answering all the points. Now, I think it's worth just saying that some familiar issues were aired here. First of all, again, alluding to the issues around freight, the idea of GBR as this body able to control access to its own network without the level of involvement of an independent regulator that applies under the current legislative regime. That's one of the issues that keeps coming back, that was explored extensively in the committee stage in the House of Commons, but where the government could always vote down the concerns there. It's a bit more flexible in the House of Lords around this issue and some of the other related issues, such as
Maggie does focus on that, doesn't she? She's worried about the ORRs basically being, to use a sexist word, emasculated somewhat.
Yes, that's right. Because if an operator, whether it's a freight operator or an open access passenger operator, is turned down for access rights to the network, they'll only be able to appeal to the Office of Rail and Road, the regulator, essentially if GBR has acted unlawfully in making that decision. They won't be able to appeal to the regulator on the merits of the case. So no longer will the regulator be able to say that an access application is a good idea and therefore should be allowed to proceed. So that's the fundamental issue that keeps on coming back in relation to freight and open access operators.
Because a judicial review will only really look at the process by which they reach their decision and not the decision itself.
Essentially, yes, that their process was perverse, irrational, or an abuse of power, I think is the legal definition. So if they can prove, if GBR can prove that they were not, in breach in that way, then the application would simply fall, and there's no other recourse for the applicant. So this is an issue that interestingly comes up of concern in the second reading in the House of Lords, not just from the opposition benches. And this is why I think the government, listening to what was said from some members on their own benches, might be a little bit worried that they could potentially lose some votes over these issues in the later stages, the more detailed scrutiny stages of consideration of the bill, because it was being signalled by some of their own backbenchers that they were worried about freight access, they were worried about open access operators being effectively kind of sanitized from the network, and also on that competition theme as well, that they were worried about the position of independent retailers. This is one of the kind of allied issues. There's been a suggestion that the big beast, Great British Railways, by amalgamating 14 existing retail platforms of the train operators in the process of being nationalised, will, in effect, become the dominant retailer in the market for train tickets as well. And of course, there is a quite active, successful and lively market being served by private sector companies such as Trainline and others. So there's a concern that they might effectively be put out of business by the big beast GBR. Some of the other issues that came up in the debate, as you would expect, would be around accessibility for people with disabilities and mobility impairments. Leading the charge there was the illustrious Baroness Tanni Grey-Thompson, the former Paralympian who sits as a crossbencher in the House of Lords, but she was supported by other members as well. And then there were issues around that the opposition was signalling that they are likely to bring up in the committee stage, such as the Conservatives, who are tending to try to characterise GBR as a sort of Soviet-era union-dominated monopoly that will hold the taxpayers and the fare payers to ransom. So they'll be trying to insert amendments into the bill, as they would see it, to mitigate against that risk, which they tried to do in the Commons, and of course, as I've said, were voted down.
Surely in this day and age, that sort of Red Scare stuff doesn't really kind of have much traction, does it?
Well, I think it's almost in the DNA of the Conservatives, I suppose, to try to present that and to present GBR as a throwback to BR, with, in some people's minds, the negative connotations that brings. So, in a sense, they're doing their job as the opposition party to raise these issues. But interestingly, there are some questions from the government side as well that could be affected by the change of Prime Minister, which we're about to see, with Andy Burnham set to become leader of the Labour Party and then Prime Minister by the 20th of July, because the minister was asked whether the provisions on devolution were adequate in the bill, because of course these were created at a time when Andy Burnham was the Mayor of Greater Manchester, and he and other metro mayors in England were asking for greater powers for devolution and local control over rail services. Now,
he has spoken on this, of course. I mean, his first major speech had the theme of devolution. In fact,
well, indeed so. And it's interesting that the minister's reply was that the limitations of railway geography restrict the options for devolution, and the bill's devolution provisions are sufficient. But of course, that's the position of the present government on the 7th of July. It might not be the position of the Labour government by the end of July. So I think watch this space.
Well, fun and games to be heard here. Yeah, yes, that's very interesting, because I think we'll probably cover this in a forthcoming podcast. But, what difference will Andy Burnham make for the transport sector generally, and the railway sector in particular? One that certainly will be of great interest.
In working on the Calling All Stations podcast for the last few years, it's been my privilege, of course, to work with Christian Wolmar, who is none other than one of the leading writers on railway and transport matters when it comes to journalism, or in this context, more importantly, the writing of books. And Christian kindly shared with me his latest book, which is due to be published at the end of July 2026. This is called Fast Track, and it describes itself as the extraordinary story of high-speed rail. And loyal listeners will know that we followed Christian while he was researching the content for this book, when he visited a number of countries which have successfully introduced high-speed rail networks and services. And those reports featured in back issues of the podcast, which you can find through our website. But now turning to the book, Christian, thanks so much for the opportunity to read it and to be the first person to read it and review it. But I've got a number of questions for you, so I'm going to set.
I hope they're not
up as
too difficult. I'm sitting in trepidation here. Kind of incisive questions that our podcast is famous for.
Well, let me see if I can do your job successfully for once. So I identified a number of themes in this book, which I think will be of interest to our listeners. And one of them was, perhaps rather to my surprise, I found the story of high-speed rail started much further back than I was expecting, really in the 19th century, and in the competition between the main rail companies in Great Britain.
Yes, no, that was a fun bit of the book in a way, because rather than honing in on Japan straight away, I thought, well, how did we get here? And when you start researching that, you find that, of course, really speed has always been the USP of the railways, right? I mean, that's what it's all about. I mean, if the trains went at the same speed as the horse and carts, it wouldn't have been very useful, would it? I mean, it would have transported a few bits of freight and stuff, but it would never attracted passengers. So getting there faster is actually, the key function of the railways. And so there were several periods in which really the railways were speeded up. So the first one was really the Great Western in the 1850s, where they really started running faster than anybody else. And then towards the end of the century, we had this series of races between the two sets of companies running on the east and west coast main line, which were really like kind of reality TV of the day. You know, everybody was following these stories of, engine drivers heroically thundering through, often breaking speed limits, it must be said, to get to be the first to get to, well, initially it was the Glasgow, and then later on it became Aberdeen, and beyond, really with the idea of kind of getting there fast enough for the people who'd start shooting grouse on August the 13th.
And interestingly, there were big personalities in the leadership of the railway companies who saw these races as big business, as good for business, didn't they, to attract customers?
That's right. And I suppose the most famous of these races was the one in the 1930s, when it was a competition between the two great locomotive engineers, Stanier and Gresley, over which could design the best steam locomotive. And it was it's a sad period in a way, because it was like the golden age of the steam trains. And if actually the Second World War hadn't happened, certainly my fellow author Jonathan Glancy, who wrote a book about this, thinks that we might have got steam engines that went even faster than Mallard's famous 126 miles an hour. And maybe steam would have lasted a bit longer with the kind of, a whole new generation of sleek steam engines. I don't actually quite agree with Jonathan's romanticism. I think the steam age, really was rightly replaced by electricity and diesel, because they were just more efficient.
Well, that brings me neatly on to my next question, because we've discussed the theme of competition between steam express operators in Great Britain. But then this was really followed by a competition between different forms of technology, wasn't it? As the operators, not just in the UK, but more broadly after the Second World War, tried to accelerate their services further.
That's right. And you had really diesel versus electric. And for a while, again, it seemed that diesel would win out. So, I mean, in the UK, for example, we ended up with, the 125s, which were diesel trains. And that was necessitated by the fact that we've never managed to electrify many of our lines. That's another question. Whereas in France, they were busy developing trains that went up to 400 and 500 kilometers per hour in tests. Sometimes at great peril. The one story I recount is where after one test, they looked at the track, and the track had been completely bent, and by the speed of the train, if another train had followed afterwards, they would have been derailed. So, but it was quite exciting. But it was over quite a long period, you have to remember, Mark. This is, 1950s, 1960s. There were these kind of test runs in various countries, and people trying to kind of do two things, actually. They were trying to get the high-speed record, right, which was, always a kind of emblematic thing. What's the absolute fastest train in the world? But they were also trying to develop technology that could then be adopted for wider use and run trains at kind of higher speed.
And that brings me on to the third aspect of competition, which is explored in this excellent new book, Fast Track, which is the competition between nations, because that became a bigger and bigger theme, really, from the 1960s onwards.
That's right. Although, I mean, Japan got in there really early. I mean, astonishingly early when you look at it. I mean, 1964 was the first high-speed track, proper dedicated track, all the kind of rules of high-speed rail. So it's dedicated track, no slow trains on it, few. It was really what I'd call the motorway of the railway world. So not many kind of junctions bringing in from other services, from other routes, and running at high speeds for long distances, linking towns and cities kind of that were quite distant apart in terms of time, and bringing them much closer. So Japan was the first one. And then, various countries in Europe mostly kind of were looking at this technology. But it took until 1981 before the French joined in and built their first high-speed line. And there was a great rivalry between France and Germany over, essentially between Siemens and Alstom, although there are some other companies involved, but in developing what would be the fastest train and the most effective technology and so on. And that rivalry kind of, in a way, spurred these two countries to develop rather contrasting types of high-speed service, with the Germans kind of using bits of high-speed track interspersed by kind of refurbished normal track, whereas the French went for the LGV, the Ligne à grande vitesse, which was certainly not used by any other trains.
And on this theme of international competition, one of the things that stood out for me was how often the spur to do something, to make this investment, starting off with Japan in the 1960s, was the run up to a major sporting event, which could be the Olympic Games or could be the World Cup. But this was seemed to be a theme running through this area.
Yes, no, that's a fascinating kind of part of the story, in that somehow having a prestigious event like the Olympic Games or the Winter Olympic Games or whatever kind of some great occasion, the World Cup, kind of spurs countries into kind of deciding to show off their technology, and they build new train services to try to accommodate the people. Or in the case of South Korea, they were so embarrassed by the failures of the transport system during their Olympic Games that they then built a high-speed line to make up for that.
Right, yeah.
Or in Brazil, where they didn't manage to get the high-speed lines built in time. And they still haven't managed to do that. But there's definitely a symbiotic relationship between kind of key sporting occasions and high-speed line.
Now, of course, this relates to the issue of political will in delivering these projects, because again, something I found very interesting from the book was that in almost every case, there was perhaps a higher degree of political skepticism and outright opposition than we might have expected from the ways that these many of these schemes are now presented as bringing universal joy.
Absolutely. And even in Japan, where there wasn't too much opposition to the initial scheme, although they had to be driven through by some very kind of committed railway people who were intent on doing this. And in fact, there was a bit of a trick that when they drew up the first budget, they knew that it wasn't going to actually pay for the whole cost, but they kind of pressed ahead. And then at the end, they got sacked because it went over budget, but they always knew it was going to go over budget. So even for the first scheme, there was some opposition. But then in Japan, after that, when they tried to build more lines, there was concerted opposition, particularly over the issue of noise. It adds cost and it adds hassle and makes the political process very difficult, and inevitably lengthens the gestation time of these projects. And I think in all the projects I looked at, there wasn't one that didn't elicit some sort of opposition. And even in the case of South Korea, there was this famous nun who kind of was worried about a sacred kind of mountain being crossed by this terrible new invention of the railway. And somehow she managed to get her and a salamander on the court case.
This was incredible. This story was absolutely incredible.
So there was a salamander who was kind of cited in the court case, and we never really found out whether the salamander turned up in court or whatever. But it was quite, there's lots of stories like this in the book that you just think, why are people find it so difficult? And there's a big contrast with the motorway network, because the motorway network across the world seems to get built, without too much fuss. Of course, we've had some hassles here, quite rightly, but by and large, they plonk down these motorways, which are much more environmentally damaging than railways. But somehow railways kind of elicit a wide range of opposition. It's very sad, really.
But there is nowhere that brings together all of these themes in some ways: international competition, major sporting events, political will, than the case study of China, which you explore in some detail in the book.
Well, as I write at the beginning of my chapter on China, you can cite the statistics. So you can cite the fact that, they built 30,000 miles of line in less than 20 years, that there's 4,400 train sets that they built, that there's something like 10,000 services on a busy day of just high-speed trains. And you can cite those statistics, but it isn't until you go there that you just realize the extent of their achievement. And it's, as I keep on stressing in everything I write about this, you can go on about, it's authoritarian, they don't care about safety, it's all kind of done in a rush, and so on. Yes, it is an authoritarian country that kind of can dictate that, but all the rest is rubbish. The safety standards are enormously high. I also would be hearing of train crashes all the time. There was one in 2011, a major train crash, and they learned the lesson from that about how disastrous that would be. And they do actually care about the environment, and they care about local people kind of opposed to it. So they build a lot of these on stilts so that local people can still get from one side of the tracks to the other, and so on. So China's achievement is just out of this, on a different scale. They built a near 200-kilometer long bridge, like one bridge that goes over wetlands.
Just say that again, because it is amazing. Just say that again for our listeners.
Nearly 200 kilometers long bridge.
A bridge, a single bridge.
And it with God knows how many spans, and that basically goes over some wetlands and some other difficult terrain. So they thought, sod this, we'll just build a bridge over this whole thing. And they built this enormous, which is the world's longest bridge. That is nearly 200 kilometers long. And you just when you compare that with, our struggles and even some of the struggles of other countries, you just wonder, how do they manage that? How do they manage that? Just the procurement process, the project management, the bringing together massive amounts of labor and do it successfully and largely on time. We don't really know whether these things are on budget because, it's all state money of one sort and another. But nevertheless, they do now have a network that just improves the whole country, and people love it. It keeps the communist regime in power because, the people feel that they've got something back out of them.
But I was shocked at one level of personal risk and liability that applied to somebody in the China story, because Liu Zhijin, who was head of China's Ministry of Railways and who was largely the sort of chief designer and pioneer and pacemaker for the whole great leap forward of Chinese state railways into high speed, ended up being sentenced to death.
Yes, well, the sentence to death is a bit kind of performative. It's not. They're still
pretty scary, though.
Yeah, but they generally commute it for those sort of offences. And he was alleged to have kind of purloined some $7 million or something, which actually, on the face of it, is not actually that. I mean, as one of the people I met in China said, well, that's not really very much for somebody in his position. And basically he fell foul of the regime somehow and ended up in jail. And there was then the Wenzhou accident, which actually happened after he was actually dismissed, and so had nothing really to do with him. But they managed to kind of associate him with it. And the poor fellow still rots in jail, but is definitely the father of the Chinese railways, high-speed rail. Without him, it might well not have happened. I mean, you have to recognize that even in an authoritarian state like China, there's still internal battles about whether high speed was a good idea. And like with many countries, they kind of considered maglev at one point, and maybe that's the way to get around fast. And actually, then they rejected it for the same reason that other countries have. But so one has to look at political factions, even in a country like China.
And it's very interesting how you explore in the book how maglev has sort of waxed and waned over the period of the last 60 or 70 years and become quite a pace setter at certain points, only to be found to be impractical or unaffordable as an alternative to metal wheels on metal rails.
Absolutely. In fact, that's the theme of the rail column I'm writing, because I think it's worth noting that both in France and Germany, and to some extent in China, there was a point at which maglev was seen as the solution. And we had a little revival of this with Elon Musk's Hyperloop, which when you look at it was nonsense, right? Running kind of maglev trains in vacuum, which made them even kind of faster and more allegedly more efficient. So we've had, this has been hanging around the transport kind of developments for the past, as you say, 50, 60 years. And basically, you say wax and waned, has largely waned, although both Japan and China are developing particular lines that may well see the light of day by the mid-2030s. But it's a technology that, rather like nuclear fusion and those sort of things, doesn't really seem to be going to deliver the hopes for it.
But of course, in this story of technological progress and infrastructure and service delivery, there are a couple of real outliers, aren't there? And one of them is the United States, and the other, somewhat perversely, given where we started this conversation, is the United Kingdom.
Yes, I devoted a chapter to the sort of failures, and HS2 and the California High-Speed Rail project have a lot in common in that work probably started too soon on them. And for example, the California High-Speed Rail project, which is supposed to link Los Angeles and San Francisco, is going to end up being a line through the Central Valley between Merced, a town of about 50,000 people, and Bakersfield, a town of about 500,000 people. And they've got no way of finding their way to Los Angeles or to San Francisco at the moment. So, and it's a bit like HS2 ending up from somewhere close to London to somewhere vaguely close to Birmingham town centre, the Acton to Aston shuttle, as I've called it. And again, kind of spending vastly more than was expected, as with the California project. And so I explore a bit what are the similarities and the differences. The differences are that, we have a functioning rail network and, we have a very good rail system, and yet we haven't managed to kind of build this HS2 at any reasonable cost and at any reasonable speed. America doesn't have a functioning passenger rail system and, has very few passenger services apart from on the East Coast. And always has huge opposition to these schemes. And that's something that is the case in the UK as well, that the opposition undoubtedly hampers these projects and ends up costing them a lot more money and making it much more difficult to complete.
Christian, I'm going to ask you in a minute, what was your number one lesson from the research and the writing of this book? But can I tell you, first of all, what was mine?
Go on.
My number one lesson was about the word Shinkansen, because your book cover is a beautiful illustration of a Japanese high-speed Shinkansen train passing Mount Fuji. And that's the image that we have of the Shinkansen, a name that evokes speed, comfort, style, sophistication. But the word actually means new trunk line in Japanese. So I was left with the thought that if back in 2009, HS2 had been called the new trunk line, which is what it really was, after all, rather than overglossed into this super exciting high-speed piece of infrastructure with all the controversy and negativity that became associated with, perhaps HS2 would have been more acceptable to the public and taxpayers than it's turned out to be.
Absolutely. And I think that the word I would try to characterize, successful schemes would be strategy, I'm afraid. I know that sounds a kind of, a rather archaic kind of word, but if you don't have a strategy working out why you want this, why you're doing it, how you're going to do it, who is going to do it for you, what is it actually going to deliver, unless you have that really strong sense of awareness of what it's all about, you're going to fail. And the example there I'll give is not China or Japan or indeed France, but is Spain. Spain is the most fantastic example of this. It's a very unlikely country to have developed, the Europe's biggest high-speed rail network. It's a relatively poor country. Towns are quite far apart, so therefore quite expensive to link and so on. And yet they had the right strategy. They knew what they were doing right from the beginning when they start their first line between, not between Madrid and Barcelona, which would be the obvious one, but between Madrid and Seville, because it had an exhibition, again, another kind of big occasion that kind of attracted high-speed lines. And then they thought, right, we can do this around the country. And we're going to do it in the same way. We're going to design this, have the same sort of stations. We're going to have the same sort of infrastructure. We're going to have the same companies doing this. And they're going to follow a clear set of rules and a clear strategy to develop a national network that is now their pride and joy. And it took about 25, 30 years. But my God, what an achievement, in a relatively poor country. So I'm afraid that my word is strategy.
Fast Track, The Extraordinary Story of High-Speed Rail by Christian Wolmar is published on the 23rd of July 2026 and is available from all good booksellers. Here's Christian's final thought from the Departure Lounge.
Well, I've just written a piece for The Guardian, which I think deserves wider attention, which is the fact that cars need a fat pill, because cars are getting wider and higher and taller all the time. And this, of course, takes up just road space, but also it poses big dangers, particularly for pedestrians, because they're more likely to be hit in the head or wherever by cars that have higher bonnets. And they also consume more fuel, and they're environmentally unsustainable. They actually squeeze out other cars from car park spaces and so on. So this is a process that must be stopped. And in the Guardian article, I make several suggestions as to how to try to reverse this process of what's called car spreading.
Thank you for listening to Calling All Stations, the transport podcast with Christian Wolmar, which is produced by Cogitamus Limited, a leading provider of public affairs consultancy services in the sector. We hope you've enjoyed this episode. If you have, please do consider giving us a 5-star rating with whichever platform you use. Do follow us on social media. You can find Cogitamus Limited, Calling All Stations podcast, Christian Wolmar and Mark Walker across a variety of platforms, including LinkedIn, Instagram, Facebook, Blue Sky, and X.